Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Effectiveness Checks, Nonconformances, and Corrective Actions. What does it all mean? Sponsored by SGS. I'm Dirk Ducharme, Editor-in-Chief for Quality Digest and your host for today's webinar. Maintaining an effective management system demands periodic third-party audits, the results of which can sometimes be a bit confusing. The purpose of this webinar is to walk through the results of some post-audits, including the terminology, the reports that may need to be generated, and the best tools to employ to handle those corrections. In this webinar, we're going to include things such as understanding nonconformances, corrective action requests, and effectiveness checks, examples of completed reports, the tools for risk management assessments, effectiveness checks, and root cause analysis. Before we get started, though, just a reminder that you can send us questions using the Q&A box. You can find the Q&A button in the bar down there towards the bottom of your screen. If you just mouse down there, you'll see it. Send your questions to us as you think of them, and we will address them after the presentation. A recording of this webinar will be available one day after the webinar. You will get an email with that information from Quality Digest. Those of you who need a certificate of attendance, this is important. If you need a certificate of attendance, you must answer at least one of the polling questions presented during the webinar. Okay, let's get started. Our presenter today, once again, is Sabrina Ippolito. With an avid passion for implementing efficient, effective, and lean quality systems, Sabrina believes that at the heart of any successful organization is a learning organization. She works with organizations to break the silo mentality plagued by many companies and helps surface an array of talent within those organizations. Sabrina is a classically trained biochemist and certified lead auditor that ensures organizations maintain compliance and certification in a realm of different industries and standards spanning pharmaceutical, cosmetics, and general manufacturing. She has directed, overseen, and improved several quality systems to reduce deficiencies and increase product flow across the US, Canada, and Europe. She is affiliated with the Professional Order of Chemists of Quebec and the American Society for Quality. Okay, Sabrina, go ahead. It's all yours.
Awesome, Dirk. Thank you so much. So everybody, hello, and welcome to yet another wonderful learning event. So just a little bit about SGS in brief. SGS was founded in 1878, as you know. In the mid-20th century, we diversified into inspection, testing, and verification industries. So this is better known as a TIC industries. We have more than 2,600 offices and labs across the world with in and around, and I think right now we're just about at 100,000 employees, and we're very, very happy and very proud of that. We are part of the business assurance portfolio. Well, at least I am, along with many of my colleagues that helped facilitated this learning event today. We span a variety of industries, as you are very well aware, from aerospace right into cosmetics, into all sorts of industries out there in food as well. So just a little bit about SGS difference. Like I said, we span the global network. We are involved in quality of service. We have quite a significant amount of industry expertise, and we always try to match subject matter experts, so our auditors or our trainers that have industry experience as well as academic experience to your portfolios, especially if you have any queries or if you have any questions, or even if you're looking for audits and for training. We are into digital innovation. I know that my colleagues have spoken to this in previous webinars. And we are very much involved in corporate sustainability as well. What I have prepared for you today, and pretty much what has ignited this conversation, were several audits that I've done in the past, and I'm starting to see reoccurring issues and events relating to nonconformances and corrective actions. On that note, I present to you the agenda for today. This is broken up into two parts. Our first part is differentiating between nonconformances and corrective actions. This is an area, for whatever reason, most organizations tend to have a little bit of difficulty deferring or differentiating between, is it a corrective action I need to open, or is it a non-conformance? So we're going to be doing a bit of a deep dive in this, and I think you're going to enjoy the poll questions that I have outlined for you today. The second part will be directed towards corrective actions. We're going to define corrective actions, look at some key aspects of a corrective action. So this, what I would highlight for you to do, and this is for both non-conformances and corrective actions, I want you to think about the processes you currently have in place. I want you to think about the discussions that you're going to hear. I want you to think about the questions that I might ask you, or about what you're going to see on the slides, and see where are the similarities, where are the differences, and then ask yourself those critical thinking questions. Should I maybe incorporate? Is there any room for improvement? Or can we do a mishmash of the two? So I want you to think about that. So don't forget to put on your critical thought caps. At the end of the two parts, we are going to be having a very quick Q&A session. So I'll be able to address some of your questions that you might have throughout the learning event today. So without further ado, let us start. And we're starting with the first poll question. Consider a negative situation that occurred within your organization. Was it straightforward to determine whether you should initiate a nonconformance report or a corrective action report? What do you think?
And Sabrina, were you saying, did I hear you right, that one of the things that's confusing for people is the difference between, what did you say, a non-conformance and a
And a
and
corrective action.
and a corrective action? Okay. How often do you see that? I mean, is that a kind of a pretty common?
I'd say, honestly, I'd say easily right now, if I do a quick trend, at least 85%, 85% of my clients. And let's be frank over here. I mean, I audit quite a lot in terms of internal audits, in terms of providing support for internal audits, or even in terms of doing certification audits. There is quite the struggle between differentiating nonconformances from corrective actions.
All right, we'll give you guys another 15, 20 seconds here to answer that question. And then we will throw the answers up and see what we got. All right.
I think it's very fair to share to say that it's in and around 85%.
Wow. Okay. All right. Let's end the poll and share the results. There, you should see those.
All good. Okay. Okay. Good. So I'm happy to see that there's many that can do this in their sleep, and I'm even happier to see in some cases that they've merged both NCRs and CARs together. This is interesting. This is also something I started seeing with many of the clients that I'm auditing. They are starting to have one system. So they're not necessarily calling it, for instance, corrective actions, non-conformances. What they're doing is that they're using the word event. An event occurred. And it could be a quality event. So for those of you that have an IMS, an integrated management system, it could be a quality event. It could be an environmental event. It could be an occupational health and safety event. And they're all using they're using the components of NCRs and CARs to address these events. So I've also started seeing people doing that. I'm happy to see that. So there's around 75% that are right on target. And for the 24%, listen, been there, done that. I get the frustration. I understand where you're coming from. So hopefully this next slide should be able to alleviate some of those pressures. So over here, and remember what I'm sharing with you, it's not an end all be all, okay? It's just to help further direct, it's to help further It's to guide your thinking process. So when we consider estimated times of completion, what I've normally seen organizations, and if you tell me, Sabrina, show me where this is written on a standard, or show me where this is written in a regulation, I wouldn't be able to show you because it's not explicitly written. So this is what we are observing within industry, what we are observing within companies that we go and audit. The estimated time of completion, generally speaking, is around 30 days for nonconformances. If we're saying no more than 30 days for nonconformances, then this is where the corrective actions kick in, and we say, well, corrective actions could be 30 days or plus. Okay. Now, I've seen some organizations, and especially if you are maybe one of the bigger companies and you're like, oh, we do not spend 30 days on this. It's more like 45, 60 days. I've seen in very rare occasions, I can think of maybe about 2 or 3 clients of mine, that it's been 90 days. So they'll take 90 days to rectify non-conformances. In that case, their corrective actions would be 90 days plus. And the reason for this, you might say, well, what in the world could possibly take you 90 days? Well, think about this. There might be, or maybe the processes or the industry that you belong to is a lot more complex. So you got more complex processes to consider. There might be additional signees, so people that have to sign or be aware of the nonconformance that occurred. In some organizations, they said, well, this is a perfect opportunity for me to include in here risk management and to do a corrective, to also do a root cause analysis. So it's a more in-depth investigation. And when we're doing more of these in-depth investigations, they tend to take more time, more resources, more planning that's required, which is obviously adding to the number of days that you're allocating to doing these nonconformances. Now, you can have very simplistic processes where you're like, Sabrina, we want to be able to document the nonconformances and be done with it. So these we can complete nonconformances within 1 day, within 2 days, to which I'd say that's fine, because you're probably going to be looking at this from a trending perspective. And whenever you're noticing that, hey, we are increasing the trends in terms of issues that we're having with one particular supplier, this is now going to trigger a corrective action where you can't spend more than 30 days in identifying what are the problems. But needless to say, you've accumulated all of those nonconformances to say, we have an issue with the supplier, but we want to do a more in-depth investigation, and therefore now we have to open up a CAR. And that CAR can also reflect and make reference to those nonconformances. So when we're talking about nonconformances, where do we typically see nonconformances? So I'm alluding more to those 25% that say, well, I'm having a bit more of a difficulty in determining, is it a CAR or is it a nonconformance? Well, if you see that there is a discrepancy, that there is an issue between what you've received and a PO that was issued to one of your suppliers, in terms of quantity, in terms of the product itself, in terms of we received the product damage. So anything from receiving, you initiate a nonconformance. If you see that there are issues in terms of kitting in production, in terms of what you've pre-weighed, for instance, this happened in one such situation where the bill of materials said that they need 45 kilograms of ingredient A. But the person who was pre-weighing ended up weighing 54. So he accidentally inverted the digits. Well, this is where the individual would say, hang on a second, I raise my hand, I raise the flag, non-conformance, it's not 54 kilos that I need 45 kilos. Open up the non-conformance, let's further investigate what's gone on. So anything that could potentially occur that is deviating from the process in production, that in itself is a nonconformance, and a nonconformance is raised. Inspection. So let's say if you are doing an in-process test, or you are doing, maybe a finished good test instead, because the in-process testing is all about tweaking. But if you are finished or you are filling and you're like, we're not filling our bottles with a shampoo, or I'm filling up my sachets with product that I'm manufacturing, could be maybe the nuts and bolts, and the weight is off. In that case, that would initiate and that would trigger a non-conformance. So anything with inspection, anything with shipping, I have to now ship my product out, for instance, product that obviously passed all of the checks and bounds during production and finished good testing. Now you need to ship the product out. If you realize that, hey, we've got a problem here, I don't have all of my shipping documentation, I don't have my C of A's, or where I'm supposed to be shipping this out isn't written in the labels that I need to affix on the shipping container. In this case, you initiate a non-conformance. And you'll notice that 4 out of those 5 bullet points are internal. So I want that to illuminate the proverbial light bulb in your mind. 80% of non-conformances can be stopped within the organization, within your organization. That means, and it leaves 20% of non-conformances are customer-based. Where do you find them? In your customer complaint register. So I want you to think about this. If you do a quick snapshot of the non-conformances you've had to date from the beginning of this year till now, how many of those non-conformances are customer related? Are you looking at about 15 to 20%? If you are, you're right on. But if you're finding out in terms of all of the non-conformances raised with the customer complaints as well, that you're hovering around the 50 or 60%, then that means you need to tighten your quality belts internally. That means that there's things that are slipping from your control. In terms of corrective actions, we open up a corrective action whenever we do an internal audit or whenever there is a second party audit that's been done. So for instance, a supplier audit. If, for instance, you've got a certification audit that was done and you happen to have a non-conformance, or a regulatory audit that was performed at your site and you happen to have a non-conformance, you have to open up a corrective action. And the reason for it is because that non-conformance was observed during an audit. You're going to now have to do an investigation to determine what happened, why did it happen, and this is what we're going to put moving forward so that it doesn't happen again. Sometimes you might have that customer that might bring in a customer complaint. And if they don't say anything, you would address it as a non-conformance. But if they tell you, we don't want you addressing it as a non-conformance, I want you addressing it as a corrective action, because I want to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Because when I receive product from you, it's so critical. I can't afford having issues with my suppliers, and we're trying to mitigate this as closely as possible. So in some cases, you might have a client that says, we don't want you opening up a non-conformance report. We want you doing an in-depth investigation, and thus we expect you to open up a corrective action. We will typically see this in areas or in industries that are more regulated, like in pharma, like in nuclear. In some cases, you might have legislative changes and you say, well, you know what, because of these legislative changes, we have a lot of work that we need to do. And you might decide that you'll use your corrective action process to help mitigate and monitor that process. Other organizations say, hey, you know what, we already have a management of change or a change control process. And within the bounds of our change control process, we can mitigate changes in legislation as well. I'd say go ahead and use your MOC in that case, or your change control. Sometimes we have ineffective nonconformances, or sometimes what we end up seeing is an upward trend of nonconformances, to which at this case, we would say, you know what? Let's close off our nonconformances. And in closing them off, we'll say, let's report or check corrective action, so forth. And that corrective action will also reference all of those nonconformances that you've pulled, because you are going to address the issue through doing an investigation, but it is pointless for you to just keep opening up a nonconformance, being that it is a recurring issue. At times, you might have what we call a deviation, but deviations are categorized as planned and unplanned. So I'm referring to unplanned deviations. The procedure tells you that these are the steps, or the work instruction lists exactly the steps that need to be followed, and you've deviated from it, and it was caught by quality, for instance. In this case, you want to determine, well, what happened? So you may decide that a corrective action makes sense because you want to investigate the problem in terms of what happened and how do we ensure that this doesn't happen again. Field failures when you're doing servicing. If any of you are in the servicing industry, you might have a corrective action to open. In other cases, you might have issues identified during management reviews. As an example, you need to talk about what are your objective targets? What are your quality objectives? Did you meet those targets? If the answer is no, we did not meet those targets, you need to open up a corrective action to determine why didn't we meet them? That requires an investigation. So when we talk about nonconformity, we can look at nonconformity as it being a non-fulfillment of a requirement. Some organizations may use other acronyms. I've seen derogation, I've seen unplanned deviations, I've seen the word discrepancies as well. I've included in here, and one of the things I'm quite famous for, I would think, is for having very convoluted PowerPoints. And the reason I do this, and there is some rhyme to my madness, is because when these documents are being shared with you, I want you to be able to go back and reflect at what some of these nonconformities in this case might look like or be for within your organization. So it's important in order for you to identify and then to contain the situation, to contain the nonconformity. And then finally, you want to be able to assess, were there any physical causes? What's the impact look like? And finally, a potential disposition. So how are we going to move forward now that we know that this is a nonconformance and this is what we did to mitigate and to manage the situation? What is our disposition? So when we're looking at documenting a nonconformity, it is important in order for us to have that nonconformity statement. And that nonconformity statement would require us to state exactly the finding in relation to the management system. And it's not just in relation to the standard tool, let's say ISO 9001, but it could be in relation to a regulatory requirement. It could be in relation to a customer need, want, and expectation that's in a quality agreement that you are not fulfilling. But it can also be in relation to your internal policies and processes. So again, there's 4 of them. It can come from regulatory, it can come from the standard, it can come from a customer need, want, or expectation. And finally, it can come from your internal processes. The evidence, well, what did you look at to say that, hey, this is a nonconformance? So what is supporting that finding? You might say, you know what, our internal audits, we're supposed to be doing 5 a year. The evidence is we've only done 4. So where am I going to refer this? Well, our internal policy and our internal procedure, as per AUD for audits, this line here, line 4.1.7 says internal audits need to be conducted 5 times a year, but we've only done them 4. Well, that's a nonconformance to exactly that line. You were under 5, but even if you're over 5, you're not exactly 5 as per your procedure. So that opens up a non-conformance. So you can say, but Sabrina, if I've done 10 a year, I'd say, yeah, you're fine that you've done 10 a year, but your procedure says 5. So it's 10, 5. 10 is not 5. 10 is 10. So that too would end up giving you a non-conformance. So then I would tell you, go back to the drawing board and how could you rearrange that sentence, or how could you rephrase that sentence so that you're always in conformance and in compliance? So when you're thinking about putting together a non-conformance, let's say a non-conformance form or an NCR, for instance, everything that's written in black is mandatory. So you need to have your header information, you need to have your description of the non-conformance, reference documents, you need to have your disposition, approval and signatures, and your closure, whatever your closure might be. So that might be, you know, what's your what did you do moving forward? Did you refund the individual? Did you change a document? If you change the document, are you maybe referencing an MOC to say, well, all document changes are being tracked through a management of change process. So all of that good stuff gets documented. Some of you might say, well, we also have an event, so we call them events. So therefore, they're a bit more wordy, our reports. And I'd say it's fine. It depends on the complexity of your organization. It depends on the complexity of your industry as well. So some of you might decide that, hey, we'd like to include in there an impact assessment. I'd say go right ahead and do it. In other cases, they say, well, we want to put a root cause analysis. We want to have one system. I'd say, go ahead, add your root cause analysis. At least you're meeting the minimum requirement for CARs for your corrective actions. And because I have a root cause analysis, I want to be able to put in my corrective actions. And then after I've implemented my corrective actions, I want to do an effectiveness check. That's fine too. And then finally, you'll have your attachments as well to show evidence that this is what it was before, and now this is what it is after. So you might have a document that looks a little bit wordy, like what I'm showcasing on the far right. And this might be something that you might want to include. I also, like, if you look at many of the forms that I generally speak with with some of the companies that I support, I say, you know, it's okay to use color codes and to include those color codes in your procedures, because at the end of the day, the system is yours. So you can say, for those of you that are opening up a non-conformance report, make sure that you document everything that's descripted in black. For those of you that are addressing this through a corrective action, everything applies on this form. And now you've created one form instead of two that is part of one system. And you've combined the two. The system doesn't say you need to have the QMS as it stands, your quality management system, ISO 9001, does not say you need to have two separate systems. It says you need to have the system. How you showcase the system is completely up to you. So use your creative juices, use your creative minds to put something in place that makes sense for your organization if you don't already have something in place. For those of you that have something in place, ask yourself, is what we have in place efficient and effective? If it is, fantastic. And if it isn't, think about some of the conversations we just had. One of the things that I'm observing that we're getting a significant amount of non-conformances, and maybe you yourselves, you can think about this as well, when you reflect and you think about your non-conformances, should you have any non-conformances. The majority of non-conformances that we see coming out of an audit are typically found in section 7 and in section 8, where 7 is your support and 8 is operations. This is if it's triggered specifically within the context of ISO 9001. So I want you to think about, even when you're doing your internal audits, or when you are doing, or when you are hosting external audits, do your auditors keep pinpointing on the support systems that you have and on operation? Are there issues in management review, in internal audits itself? Where are the problems coming? And you'll see, generally speaking, they're quite aligned to section 7 and section 8 as well. So I figured we'd play a little bit of a game. I'm going to show you a couple of scenarios. And you're going to let me know whether or not the situation that you see is a conformance or if it is a non-conformance. So our first situation here is during an audit of a manufacturing facility, the auditor observes a technician using a torque wrench to tighten bolts on an assembly line. The technician applies the wrench, then resets it and applies it again to ensure the bolts are properly tightened. When asked about the procedure, the technician explains that the torque wrench was recently calibrated, showing the auditor a calibration sticker with a valid date. The auditor checks the equipment calibration records and notes that the calibration interval for the torque wrench is set to every 18 months. However, the auditor then observes that the technician is using the torque wrench to verify the tightness of the bolts after already having applied it. The auditor reviews the standard operating procedure, so basically the SOP for this task, and finds that the procedure specifies that the torque wrench should be applied once and not reused on the same bolt, as this can lead to over-tightening and potentially damaging the equipment. Is this a nonconformity? Yes or no?
And we'll let you guys answer that. Quick question here while we'll let people do that. Are you differentiating corrective actions versus nonconformances based on the elements of quality management?
If we're going to increase the scope of quality management, yes, because it's not just based, like ISO 9001 is the framework, it's a stepping stone for everything quality. So for instance, if you're in nuclear, you might start with an ISO 9001, but then you might get into the more complex standards where you're adding on to what is already existing. This is typically what I have done also in pharmaceutical, for instance, where I will use the framework of ISO 9001 and add on the GMP aspect of 9001. So when we're talking about non-conformances, and this is also where things start getting a little bit more complex, because the second regulatory gets is involved. We're not talking about necessarily non-conformance. We're not talking about a non-compliance. So we have to be very careful with the terminology. I hope I answered that question. If I did not, I encourage you to reach out to me at the end of the learning event, and I'd be happy to have a discussion with you on this as well. Good.
Okay, you should see your results there.
Yes, very nice. So the answer is yes, it is a nonconformance. And the reason why it's a nonconformance is because while the torque wrench, or how to use the torque wrench, is not explicitly defined in the ISO 9001, it is defined in the internal practices of the organization. So you have a specific procedure, not a standard operating procedure, that tells you do not reuse the torque wrench on a bolt that's already been tightened. So the nonconformance is on an internal requirement. You can have, again, remember, you can have nonconformances / noncompliances in 4 areas: regulatory, standard required, so let's say an ISO 9001, customer-based, and internal, so your internal policies, procedures, work instructions, and so forth. Make sense? This is your second scenario. During an audit at a pharmaceutical packaging facility, the auditor observes a technician using a calibrated thermometer to stir a liquid solution in a mixing tank. When asked why the thermometer was being used for stirring instead of temperature measurement, the technician confidently responds that the thermometer was recently calibrated, showing the calibration certificate with a valid date. The auditor reviews the standard operating procedure and finds that the thermometer is only approved for temperature measurement and should not be used as a steering device. Using the thermometer in this manner could compromise the accuracy of future temperature readings and potentially contaminate the solution provided it breaks. Is this situation a nonconformance?
All right. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Let me see if there's a quick question I can throw at you here. Oh, this is kind of more of a statement, but in our system, everything would start as a nonconformance. Then actions for nonconformance would include corrective actions. How do they not link directly, or do they link directly? I'm not sure what she's asking there, but so basically they're saying, I think somebody else made the same comments. They're basically moving from a nonconformance to a CAR.
And that's fine too. It depends on the way that you build your system. Some people look at nonconformances as I want to document it and I don't want to have a convoluted system, but I just want to document the occurrence because they trend the type of nonconformances that they have. And then based on the trending, they look at, well, where are our bigger nonconformances, where are they coming out from? And they create in process improvements to which they then use a corrective action to address, the investigation and the corrective and the actions that are going to come from that investigation. So it really depends on the way that you have it set up, but that's fine too. That's perfectly okay. So the answer is yes, this is a nonconformance. And the reason it's a nonconformance is similar to the scenario number one. First of all, a thermometer is never to be used as a steering device. Thermometers have mercury in them, especially if you're thinking about the glass thermometers. And the last thing you want is to have a breakage in your system or in the mixing tank, as an example, or in a mixing beaker, where you now have to get rid of all of that. And, you're going to have to go through cleaning. You're going to have to go through putting everything that was manufactured into waste because it's now contaminated with mercury. So much like scenario number one, scenario number two is a nonconformance. Good. Let's look at scenario number three. So during an audit at an electronics assembly plant, the auditor notices that the multimeters used on the production line are labeled with only an asset identification number without a visible sticker indicating the next calibration due date. The multimeters are, however, traceable to detailed calibration records in the company's database, which include calibration dates and due dates for recalibration. The auditor checks the company's procedure for equipment calibration management and finds that it specifies that all calibrated tools must have a label indicating the next calibration due date. However, the company's actual practice is to maintain calibration information in a centralized digital system accessible to all employees, where they can verify the status of any tool by looking up the asset number. Is this a nonconformance?
Okay, we'll let that one go. And okay, so we had a couple questions or statements related to one of your first slides where you had, I believe, nonconformance less than 30 days to address,
Sure.
corrective action greater than 30 days to. The way I read what you were saying is that basically, a nonconformance is a slip, it's something that can be taken care of in relatively little time. Let's call it less than 30 days. Those aren't specific. Those
No.
aren't, that's not like a hard number, that 30 days.
No. Here, I'll throw it for the one that made the comment. Show me where it's written that it has to be 30 days. And I said that specifically. It is not explicitly written anywhere that it needs to be handled within 30 days. I gave the example in one case, it was 90 days because the situation is a lot more complex. It's a guide. It's meant to be used as a guide. They're not hard numbers for you to abide by.
Right. Okay. And, okay, let's go ahead and share. Hello, there we go. Share the results. Whoops, wait a minute. Let's share the results. Okay.
So
There we go.
okay, so I see where this is going. So this depends on many things, right? Like, I mean, we know that that the standard ISO 9001 does not require us to have everything documented. So in explaining the procedure, now this is where it becomes a little bit tricky, right? If the procedure says that you need to have a calibration sticker and you do not have a calibration sticker, you only have an asset number, I'm going to ask you a question. Is the calibration sticker the same thing as an asset number? It's not. So this is also a nonconformance. And this is also what we tend to see, and I see this a lot in industry. But Sabrina, we did an improvement. I'm like, I get it, but in part of your improvement, you also didn't change your procedure. You need to reflect your current practices in your documentation. Whenever you have documentation, if you've decided it is necessary for you to have that documentation documented, it is now your responsibility to ensure that the information in that document is accurate. So in this case, you would have to go back into the procedure and say, it's okay to just have an asset number, or equipment is traceable by at minimum using an asset number. Because if I also have a calibration sticker, then that's fine too. You're giving yourself almost like a range. So give yourself some rope so that you're not tying yourself in. So by using words, trigger words like at minimum, no more than, or delegate is what can get you out of enough issues, I would say. So good. Scenario number 4, the management review process was evaluated during an audit at a manufacturing company, and the auditor observed that certain critical areas were not documented as having been reviewed during the management review meetings. The auditor reviewed the minutes and records from recent management review meetings and found no evidence that the following areas were discussed: the status of product regulatory compliance, previous management review results, monitoring and measurement results, and the results of internal audits. My question to you is this scenario a nonconformance?
Let's see if I can find another quick one here. Let's see, what do we got? We got a question here about action limits. Do you want to take that one?
Sure.
How would you use action limits to define when NCR should be referred to the CAPA procedure, and what are reasonable action limits?
Okay, so when I'm hearing the word action limits, it's taking, I don't know what industry this person is from, but when I'm thinking action limits, I'm thinking pharmaceutical. This is where my head is taking me. This is also, I mean, paralleled with my academic background and my professional background too. So for instance, if I have product in a cold room, so a walk-in refrigerator, for instance, and I know my product has to be between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius. All my vaccines have to be kept between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius, at least the ones that are in there. I might set action limits at 3 degrees and at 6 degrees, so that once I reach 3 degrees, I'm still within specification, but that's going to sound an alarm that, hey, Sabrina, do something because there's something going wrong here. So that's how I use action limits. Action limits are great to be used, but don't give yourself too much deviation. Like I specifically said, 3 to 7, because the thing is, in, let's say, cold chambers, sometimes you do have like spikes that increased temperature, especially on hot summer days, or when you're keeping the refrigerator door for open a little too long, and especially if the worst case scenario was determined and that's where you put the probe, you can have fluctuations in temperature. So it's important that you give yourself enough time. Now, if your walk-in unit is very large, I'd say I don't think 3 degrees Celsius makes sense, or 7 degrees Celsius makes sense as an action limit. I'd say because you'd have to act quickly, you'd have to start removing things from such a large area, I might increase that to 3.5, maybe 6.5, so that I can buy time. I mean, your product is still conforming, but it's giving you you need to act quickly, because we're gonna, if we trend in this pattern, we will have nonconformances. So that's how I use my action limits. So is this a nonconformance? Yes, it is. Very good. Excellent. It is a nonconformance.
And Sabrina, you've got about 10 minutes if you want to leave a few minutes for questions. So
Absolutely. So corrective actions, here's an example of a corrective action, or this is, I mean, we're talking about corrective actions next. I'm sorry, I apologize. You threw me off there, Dirk.
right.
So corrective actions, they are structured and intentional steps taken to identify and eliminate root causes of nonconformances, which ensure that they do not, or we hope that they don't, reoccur. In the context of QMSs, so like ISO 9001, corrective actions play a vital role in sustaining and enhancing quality of products, of services, and processes as well. So if we look at just what I have written on the bottom, we've got steps 1 through 5. Essentially, very briefly said, as a guide, we want to identify the problem, investigate the root cause, propose corrective actions, assign responsibilities and deadlines, and then finally, we want to monitor and do follow-up. That would be like an effectiveness check, if you will. So when we're looking at key aspects of corrective actions, one of the things that I've noticed organizations do say, well, we're going to use an FMEA, or we're going to use only the 5 whys. What I encourage you to do whenever you are trying to determine what occurred and why it occurred, I suggest, and this is what I tell everybody, give people the option to choose how they're going to investigate the problem. Do they feel comfortable using a 5 whys? Do they feel comfortable using failure modes effects analysis for all my engineers out there? Do they feel comfortable using a fishbone diagram? It is up to the individual who is going to spearhead the investigation to use the tool that they feel comfortable using. Remember, we all come from different walks of life. We all have different experiences. But if at the end of the day, we want people to be responsible for spearheading corrective actions, we should be able to align them, yes, but help them use the tools that they feel comfortable using. So section 1 in a form for corrective actions, you want to describe the event and what are the immediate actions that you're taking to contain the nonconformance. Your second section might involve a risk analysis. I love incorporating risk management in my corrective actions because I get to showcase how once I look at a nonconformance, this is the risk. After I've implemented my corrective actions, after having done a root cause analysis, we now implemented our corrective actions. There's a waiting period. I can now reassess the risk. And this helps determine the effectiveness check and any follow-ups that need to be done. So this is the way I like to do it. So corrective actions. So corrective actions are key to continuous improvement. We know this, and they do help organizations uphold compliance with regulatory requirements, conformance with standards. They help boost operational efficiencies. They help elevate customer satisfaction. So we can use this to increase the quality of the processes, of the products that we're manufacturing, of the services that we're rendering our customers. So I want us to consider, for instance, scenario 4. Okay, the one that we just read about the individual who is responsible for carrying a management review, but doesn't even know how to do a management review, okay? So this is the situation. We have a nonconformity statement. So the management review process is ineffective. And we know it's ineffective because we generated a nonconformance from it. The evidence is that there's no evidence supporting that the following were reviewed during management review: the status of product regulatory compliance, previous management review results, monitoring and measurement results, and the internal audit results. So when we reviewed this, we noticed that these are elements that were not discussed. The reference that we're making could be twofold. I'm referencing the requirement of ISO 9001, which is section 9.3, and maybe if one does exist within your organization, the procedure for management review. The root cause is identified as such. Management reviews are being conducted without an agenda because the person conducting them was not aware of ISO 9001 requirements for management reviews. So the individual is not aware. The corrective action that was taken, and the only corrective action taken, is a proper agenda for management review was developed and will be used from now on. My question to you is this issue raised, effectively addressed? Now you're looking for the effectiveness. Is this effectively addressed? Yes or no?
Second, sorry about that. Got a little behind. Okay. All right. Let's get that going. Quick question. How do we distinguish between minor and major cars?
That is a very good question. So if you're doing this as an internal audit, I want to put it out there that it is not a requirement to classify the type of nonconformance if you are performing an internal audit. You are not required to classify it. Minor nonconformances are one-offs. I happen to be reviewing internal audits. I noticed that there was an internal audit that should have been done in July. This was skipped. There's no corrective action, or there was no statement as to why it was skipped. It was just forgotten about. That might be a minor. And the reason why that would be considered a minor is because the other internal audits were done. A major nonconformance could be a systemic issue. It could be a regulatory requirement that's not being met. It could be a significant number of minors of the same type of issue. Let's say documentation. You have issues in documentation, production, in shipping, in testing, which now say, okay, well, it's a major instead. Okay. Oh boy, we almost have a 50-50 split. Okay, so let me ask you a question. I want to know, why is someone who has maybe no knowledge of the standard carrying out a management review? So the corrective action in terms of a proper agenda for management review, that's fine. That's being implemented. That's good. That answers the nonconformity. But why did it occur? So this requires us to do an investigation. So if we go back and we look at, for instance, this form that I'm suggesting right over here, okay? Now, again, this is my form. Like, I took something very simplistic, but not all my forms look like this. It depends on the organizations that I'm supporting. So it becomes important for us to describe the nonconformity, which we've described it in the earlier slide. The immediate action in this case would have been to document an addendum to address the following regarding previous management review results, product regulatory compliance, the monitoring and measurement of results, and results of internal audits. Then I've decided, well, oops, sorry about that. Then I decided to do a risk analysis. Section 3 is the fun stuff. This is where we use our creative juices. In section 3, I happen to use the why analysis because that's what I felt comfortable using. Somebody else might say, well, Sabrina, I feel comfortable using a fishbone diagram. That's fine too. You might decide to use a fishbone. And then based on what you found from either using a 5 whys or using a fishbone, you will document what does the corrective action plan look like. And you'll notice that in my 7 steps to address the situation, I'm not writing you a novel. You don't need one. What are the things that need to be done? If you're wanting to do a thesis, I encourage you to go get higher studies in university. This does not have to be convoluted. Again, industry dependent. This has to be point form. Try to make it point form as much as you possibly can. What needs to be done? Execute the task. Who are you assigning it to? Use the name. When is it due? You can go by exact date, like October 15th, 2024. You can speak in terms of the month and the year, or you can talk in terms of quarter. And then what's the closure date? And finally, we get to the last section, or the last 2 sections, where we're looking at effectiveness checks and risk analysis as well. The risk analysis post the corrective action is a good way of showcasing that at the initial part, this was the risk to our management system. And now that we've put in place the system, and now that we've evaluated the process that we put in place, we now have a risk that shows that it is properly managed. It's a way of showcasing that our improvements are in fact working. So how do we evaluate effectiveness? We want to review the nonconformity description, assess the root cause, ensure the proposed corrective actions effectively address both the problem and its root cause, confirm that the corrective action has been implemented, and finally, verify that the corrective action has successfully prevented the nonconformity. And this may require a waiting period. It could require a couple of months, a couple of weeks, in some cases, a couple of years, such as, for instance, if you're procuring equipment, it's not every month that you're procuring a new piece of equipment. On that note, just to let you know, SGS is offering a back to school percentage off. So if you're interested in taking any one of our courses that we do offer, you will be given a 20% off on those courses. And we have some interesting classes coming up in the next little bit, in the last quarter of the year. I leave it to you. Some questions and answers. Dirk, what did you find for me?
All right, so we got a few here. We got a few minutes. We'll take a few. If we don't get to them, don't worry. I will forward the questions on to Sabrina afterwards. Okay, is there some document or standard with the rules for escalating a car process based on severity, occurrence, or some other similar rules?
Dirk, I'm going to ask you to please repeat that question because you cut off. I didn't hear everything.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Is there some document or standard that has rules for escalating to a car based on the severity, occurrence, or some other rules?
I have not come across a specific document, but I think there is a risk management document that you can leverage, and it's an ISO document. I am going to see this question in the question bank. What I will do is I will get that question, and I'm happy to send that off to you. I'll answer that question. I can't think of the one off the top of my head, but I know that there is something that does exist. Now, for escalation purposes, it's difficult to say that this is when we escalate, because if you're using a framework like 9001, it's so many different industries that can use that framework. So that being said, we can't say, well, this is when you escalate versus this is when you don't escalate. What I would recommend that you do is use your risk management analysis table, whatever it is that you use for analyzing risk, and have that being your factor to saying, well, when is it that I escalate this?
Okay. Is there a reason, or are there any reasons when you can cancel your effectiveness check?
If it's been determined that you do not need, so maybe you might have said, hey, we have to open up a corrective action, but then finally it was determined that we're not going to open up a corrective action. Like, effectiveness check is really triggered to the corrective action. So then you can say, well, we're not going to do the effectiveness check because we've downgraded the event from a corrective action down to a nonconformance, and nonconformances are simpler for you to complete or for you to fill in because of the event that's occurred. That's one of the areas that I can see for not delving in and completing an effectiveness check.
Okay, so this is hearkening back to an earlier slide. This person says the corrective action definition seems very similar to preventive action. Kind of more of a statement, but maybe you want to address that.
So I see where you're going at with this. So obviously your corrective actions that you're implementing is to naturally prevent something from reoccurring. So maybe that's where you're seeing the similarity. But generally speaking, we will put corrective actions in place, and I encourage you to go back to one of those earlier slides that we looked at the beginning, where I gave, and again, it's not an exhaustive list. It is not an exhaustive list, what I listed for nonconformances and for corrective actions, but we would typically open up a corrective action to address at least everything that I have on that column, which will hopefully prevent any further situations from occurring in the future. But corrective actions can also be open as a result of risk. And as you know, risk has replaced the preventive action. So I can see how you get into little murky waters there. I can definitely acknowledge that, and I definitely appreciate that. I'm doing my best to create that distinction as much as I possibly can, but also keep in mind that the reasons why we have corrective actions is to prevent any further occurrences from occurring.
Right. And somebody wrote in saying, asking for that you were looking for, isn't there a standard that addresses the when you escalate to a
Yes.
This person is saying he thinks it's ISO 31,000 risk management.
That's the one.
There you go. All right.
Thank you for the community and the collaboration. I appreciate this greatly. Thank you very, very much. You got me out of a bind there. I appreciate that.
There we go. Okay, well, we are out of time. So Sabrina, once again, excellent webinar. Really appreciate it. Cram-packed with all sorts of good information.
Thanks.
And, for all of you who attended, several of you asked if the recording is available. Yes, a recording is available. It will be, you will get an email with that information about 24 hours from now. So keep your eyes open on that. It'll be coming from Quality Digest. So once again, thanks, Sabrina. Thanks to all of you for attending. And thanks again for SGS for sponsoring this. And we will see you at the next webinar. So long.
And thank you.